This weekend, one of the top candidates for Jets head coach Aaron Glenn had a brutal game in the divisional playoffs, but this should have zero impact in whether the Jets decide to hire him or not. I'll explain why today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Monday, January 20th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use all lowercase LockedOnNFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5. On today's show, we're going to talk about a departure from the Jets coaching staff. We're going to talk about why the length of the process to hire a new head coach and general manager is really not that big of a deal. But let's begin with the topic that most of the Jets fan base has been discussing over the last 24 hours, and that was the performance of the Detroit Lions Saturday night in the divisional playoffs, and more notably, the performance of the Lions defense, which is run by defensive coordinator Aaron Glenn, who is currently viewed as one of the top candidates, perhaps the top candidate to be the New York Jets head coach. Now, the Lions' loss actually means that this process can move quicker than it might have otherwise, because with the Lions out of the playoffs, Glenn can, first of all, meet with the Jets in person. He can now do an in-person interview this week. And second, the Jets can offer him the job now, and he can accept the job. A coach cannot officially accept a head coaching job until the team he works for is out of the playoffs. So this perhaps will expedite things a bit for the Jets, especially since Glenn is viewed as one of the top candidates. Now, I think the question a lot of Jets fans have after that game is, should Glenn be one of the top candidates? Because there's no sugarcoating it. It was a horrible performance by Detroit, a Detroit team that was a big favorite, just came out and played an awful game. And that was particularly true on the defensive side of the ball. Washington put up 45 points. Now, there was a pick six, so I mean, we can call it 38, which is still a very bad night. The Commanders, 481 yards of offense in this game, averaged 6.6 yards per play. They threw for 299, they ran for 182. It was ugly for the Detroit Lions. Well, 27 first downs for Washington. I mean, it was a disaster game. So the question a lot of Jets fans have after that game is, should Glenn be our top choice? And I'm not going to answer that question because there's a lot that goes into that. But what I will tell you is that performance should not radically make you change your mind one way or another about Aaron Glenn. If you did not like Glenn, then, I mean, I don't think that game really is going to do a whole lot to sway your opinion. But even if Detroit had thrown a shutout, if you did not like Glenn, I don't think it really should have changed your mind. And if you were a big Aaron Glenn fan before the game, well, I'm sorry, one game should not sway everything. One game is one game. And this happens this time of year. I always joke after week one that it's overreaction week, that everybody always reacts to the first week of the season. But the reality is, in the NFL, in some ways, every week is overreaction week. You see it with the Jets. Whenever the Jets win a game, people act like they can never lose again. Whenever the Jets lose a game, people act like they can never win again. And the results of one game are overanalyzed incessantly. I mean, think back to the Jacksonville game. The Jets barely escaped by one of the worst teams in the NFL, and that became run it back week. People took the results of one game against the horrible Jaguars team and used that as evidence the Jets should bring back a core which had completely failed. You see it all the time in these situations that, like a coordinator, especially true in the playoffs, a coordinator either has a great game and he suddenly becomes a really hot candidate, or a coordinator has a really bad game and people question him. But one game's one game. You're not focused on one specific game plan. Now, I'm not going to defend the job Glenn did in that game. He did a lousy job. He was too reluctant to call off the blitzes when they weren't working. He was a little too stubborn. It was a bad performance. I'm not saying it was a good performance. What I'm saying is that the job of the next head coach of the New York Jets is not the same job as Aaron Glenn had Saturday night. Saturday night, Aaron Glenn had a job, which he failed at, to put together a good game plan and call good plays and run the defense effectively. The job of the head coach of the New York Jets will be, over a multi-year period, to build a winning team. And that means surrounding yourself with a good staff on both sides of the ball. It means having a plan to develop players. It means understanding the systems you run and working hand in hand with the front office to get the players who have the traits that you need. It's not about retroactively going back to the 2024 divisional playoffs and coming up with a better game plan for the Washington Commanders. Those two jobs are very different. And one game can give you really bizarre results. You know, what's funny is all the people who, after that game, said, well, Aaron Glenn should be out. I wonder how many of them a year ago were mocking the winning coach Saturday night, because the winning coach was Dan Quinn. And a year ago, Dan Quinn was Dallas's defensive coordinator. And in the playoffs last year, the Green Bay Packers went into Dallas and put 48 points up on Dan Quinn's defense. So does that really eliminate him? Should Dan Quinn have not gotten the Washington job? Well, I actually remember at the time, a lot of people were mocking Washington for hiring Quinn off that performance. But as it turns out, one game as a defensive coordinator actually doesn't tell you a whole lot about somebody's ability to run a full team as a head coach. There's a lot of context that needs to go into this stuff. And, a lot of times people use a coordinator's rankings to judge whether or not he's going to be a head coach. And even that's not a very good judge of these things, because Mike Tomlin was a coordinator for 1 year who was Minnesota's defensive coordinator in 2006 and was hired by the Steelers in 2007. That year, the Minnesota Vikings had the 14th ranked scoring defense. Sean McVay, he was hired as the Rams head coach in 2017. He had 3 years of experience as Washington's offensive coordinator to that point. They were 26, 10, and 12 in points scored in those 3 seasons. So like Sean McVay was putting up leading offenses. They were above average, but Sean McVay wasn't lighting the league on fire. They're different skill sets. And I think frequently this is one of the problems, I think, the way the media presents this stuff, because the media will always tell you about the great job this coaching candidate did with X team's defense, or the great job this defensive coordinator candidate did with Y's team's offense or defense. It's not about your performance in a year as a coordinator. It's about, do you have the traits to be a successful head coach? We've talked a lot about this on this podcast, that resume doesn't mean a whole lot when you talk about a head coach, because the job of head coach is so different from being a coordinator or a position coach. The job of head coach means you're in charge of the whole operation. It means that you're running everything. And there are lots of guys who are great assistants, fantastic assistants, Super Bowl winning assistants. If the Hall of Fame let in assistants, they'd be Hall of Fame level assistants who simply cannot handle the top job. And the reverse is also true. There are people who are hired very young. I just named you 2 of them, Tomlin and McVay. McVay had just turned 30. Tomlin was in his 30s when he was hired by Pittsburgh, guys without much experience who step in and they're just naturals on the job because they know how to do the things that make coaches successful, building a staff. Every coach brings certain things to the table, but they have certain gaps in their skill sets. It's about filling in those gaps by hiring the right assistants. Again, working hand in hand with your front office to identify the players you need, especially in a rebuilding job. These are the things that are important. It's not about the scheme you bring in so much. It's especially not about a one-game performance. I mean, Kyle Shanahan, his last game as a coordinator was with the Atlanta Falcons in the Super Bowl against the Patriots. He was heavily criticized for his situational play calling. That was the 28-3 game. And Atlanta blew the game. And Shanahan, there was a lot of questions about Shanahan's refusal to run the ball in certain situations, to just take what would have been an easy field goal that could have iced the game for Atlanta. Well, he had a bad game that night, but that didn't mean he was going to be an unsuccessful head coach. If you liked Aaron Glenn before the game, your opinion shouldn't be different. And that's the same. I said this last week. People asked about Brian Flores. I said, shouldn't Brian Flores be out since Minnesota had such a terrible performance against the Rams? And the exact answer I gave was, well, if Aaron Glenn's Lions defense gets lit up on Saturday night, should that really eliminate him? The answer is no. And the answer is we should not overreact too much to a single game. Now, during the Locked On Jets podcast, I'll have some thoughts on the search in general. There's a lot of apprehension in this fan base about the pace of it. I can't tell you that the search is going to be a success, but I don't think that the apprehension over the length it's taking, the length of time it's taking the Jets to find a new head coach or general manager is very well placed. And I'll explain why as we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by LinkedIn. Growing your small business in 2025 comes down to how well you can hire. And let's face it, better hires start with smarter insights. That's where LinkedIn comes in. With the strongest hiring data available, LinkedIn helps you identify the right candidates, giving you the confidence to make the best decisions for your business. Small businesses are wearing a lot of hats, so every hire is critical. LinkedIn gets that. That's why they connect you with the best candidates using data you won't find anywhere else. From unique skills and interests to the connections you share, LinkedIn helps you find the right person for the job. In fact, 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn has helped them find high quality candidates. Of course, the Jets are looking for some people. The Jets are looking for a new general manager and head coach. They've turned to the 33rd team, but if they didn't have the 33rd team, maybe they'd turn to LinkedIn. Hire smarter this year and find your next great hire on LinkedIn. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is also brought to you by Prize Picks. It's playoff time, and if you're like me, you want to make the most of these final weeks of football action, and that's where Prize Picks comes in. If you love football and want a chance to win real money while watching the games, Prize Picks is the place for you. It's the best way to turn your sports opinions into cash with daily fantasy player projections. With Prize Picks, you simply pick more or less on player stats like total passing yards or rushing touchdowns for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your money. You can make your picks in less than 60 seconds, and whether you're looking for a flex play to boost your payout or want to cash out quickly, Prize Picks has got you covered. And with over 10 million members and billions in winnings, it's clear that people are loving this platform. And here's a special offer for Locked On NFL listeners. Download the app today and use code Locked On NFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup at Prize Picks. Again, download the app today and use code Locked On NFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks. Run your game. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes through the week, each day, Monday through Friday. The Jets, of course, are searching for a new head coach and general manager. It feels like this has been going on for a while. It feels like these searches have been going on for a while, in part because the Jets fired Robert Salah back in October and fired Joe Douglas, their general manager, back in November. So the Jets have had plenty of time to get this ready. They hired the 33rd team, which is, a site that does a lot of football work to help them run these searches. But they did that, around Thanksgiving. So I think a lot of Jets fans are getting impatient and they're seeing a few hires be made. The New England Patriots, of course, hired Mike Vrabel as their head coach a few days back. And then since we last spoke, the Tennessee Titans, the reports have broken that the Tennessee Titans will hire Chiefs Assistant General Manager Mike Borgonzi as their new general manager. That was a candidate the Jets were interviewing, a candidate who, it didn't seem like the top candidate for the Jets, but somebody who was in the mix for the Jets. And you always find this, that after one of these searches goes for a couple of weeks, everybody starts to panic. And everybody starts to wonder, what's going on? Why haven't we made a hire? There are a couple things that need to be said about this. First of all is, there's the idea that the Jets have gotten a head start on these searches. And that's true to an extent. But the extent that true is far lesser than people make it out to be. The Jets did fire Robert Salah back in October. The Jets did fire Joe Douglas back in November. But you have to remember that teams cannot begin speaking with candidates until the regular season ends, unless they are not employed in the NFL. So the Jets were able to speak with a few people. They were able to chat with Thomas Dimitroff, the former general manager of the Falcons, who's not employed in the league. They were able to chat with John Robinson, the former Titans general manager, not currently employed in the league. They were able to chat with Louis Riddick, ESPN analyst, who obviously is not employed by the league because he works with ESPN. And the head coaching front, they interviewed Ron Rivera, a former NFL head coach, who, again, not employed by the league. But the bulk of the interviews could not begin until week 18 was finished. And that was just a couple of weeks ago. The head start the Jets got was really understanding which candidates they'd want to interview. And you saw that the Monday after the season ended, that the Jets put out a lot of interview requests because they were ready to go. They were more ready than any other team. But that head start's really only a half step. It really doesn't give you that big of an advantage. And I think you also have to remember that these are big jobs, and especially if you're casting a wide net like the Jets are, if you're interviewing a lot of candidates, if there's no like clear leader in the clubhouse, and you want to speak to as many people as possible, it's going to take time to go through everything. And I think in many ways, the NFL coaching and general manager hiring processes are flawed. You think about the significance of these jobs, and it's not just me saying this. I mean, you've heard guests, if you're a longtime listener, you've heard guests on this podcast say this through the years, that these jobs in many ways kind of resemble being a Fortune 500 CEO, even the head coaching job, because it's so much about management. And Fortune 500 companies, they can take 6 months to hire a CEO. And you think about the NFL, it's like you go 2 weeks and everybody starts panicking if you don't have somebody in place. And I think that speaks to, first of all, how inefficient NFL hiring processes are. I think it speaks to why there are so many coaches and general managers who fail, because the process is just so rapid. It's so fast. Again, 3 weeks feels like a really long time. It feels like a really long time in this league. But the challenge is it's difficult to not make the process happen quickly because the Senior Bowl is just a couple of weeks away. The scouting process goes on. And you need your systems in place. You need to know who's going to be making the calls. You need to know what systems you're going to be running. Part of me wonders like whether you should just hire a head coach like after the offseason, whether maybe you should take a couple months and just let an interim guy run the draft for a year or something. Because you look at how ineffective and inefficient these processes are. I mean, they produce a lot of bad results. You're always obsessed with that first offseason, but first offseason is the least important one. Maybe it'd be better off. Maybe teams would be better off taking a longer amount of time to vet these coaches and general manager candidates. Maybe you'd have a higher success rate, even if that first offseason was more difficult. But that's not going to happen. We know that the Jets are going to hire somebody in the days and weeks ahead. One of the things that makes it easier is this week, the Jets can start conducting in-person interviews with candidates like Aaron Glenn, who are not part of the playoffs. The Jets have not been able to have in-person interviews to this point with head coaching candidates. Today is the first day where that's allowed. So that's another part of the process. And also there's a process of weeding things out. Jets have spoken with a lot of candidates, so that takes a lot of time. Now you have to move on to your second round of interviews because, a lot of the first round GM interviews, it felt like was just kind of weed guys out. Those first round interviews took about 2 hours. I don't think you're going to turn your organization over after a 2-hour chat with somebody. You're not going to put them fully in charge of football operations after only speaking with them once for a couple of hours. You'll need more time to vet this stuff. So I don't think there's anything wrong with the length of time it's taking the Jets right now. I mean, I think it's more important to get this hire right. If that takes a couple extra days, then so be it. The bigger concerns are obviously about, do the people in charge know what they're doing, particularly ownership, because I don't know if we can trust the owner to make the right hire. And when I say all of this, when I say the timeline's fine, that's different from me saying that the Jets are a lock to make good decisions, because we know that they're not. And we know that the ownership is very shaky. We know the ownership is very damaging. We know the ownership's very erratic. It's a bad ownership. And I think there are questions about some of the candidates the Jets have interviewed. I think you look at the list of the candidates the Jets have interviewed, you look at some of the list of the candidates the Jets have passed on interviewing, there are a few head scratchers in there. Mike Locksley of Maryland is interviewed, but Mike McCarthy, they don't even ask if he's interested in interviewing. There are definitely some head scratching decisions. I think you also have to worry about whether the Jets are hiring a head coach and a general manager on parallel tracks, because with the Jets, it's consistently been an issue. Are the head coach and general manager on the same page? And if they're not, does Woody Johnson jump in and start dictating things? Those are concerns. And when I say all this stuff, it's not to say that there are zero concerns, because of course there are concerns. And of course, the Jets are not exactly an ownership group that has earned the benefit of the doubt. But I don't think that it's really a panic because Tennessee's gotten its GM in place or New England's gotten its head coach in place. Most of the teams with openings have not filled them yet. So there's still a lot of time. It's a long process. It's going to play itself out. This is not something to worry about at this point in time. If it is, I'll let you know. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to say goodbye to a guy who's been with the Jets the last 4 years, had a very prominent role. Jeff Ulbricht has a new job. Believe it or not, he's not going to be the Jets' next head coach. I'll have some thoughts on Ulbricht and his next stop as we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the playoffs even more exciting. And right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. That's $300 to keep the action going. The FanDuel app is easy to navigate, and the variety of bets keeps every game exciting. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. No waiting around for your winnings. Whether you're betting on your favorite team or just looking to add some extra excitement to the playoffs, FanDuel has you covered. And we now have the conference championship game set. The Eagles will be big favorites over Washington in the NFC championship game and NFC East battle. The AFC championship game, it's a heavyweight title bout. The Kansas City Chiefs, the Buffalo Bills. Can Buffalo finally slay the dragon? Can the Chiefs come one step closer to a three-peat, becoming the first team to win 3 Super Bowls in a row? Difficult to say, but if you've got strong feelings, again, FanDuel is the place to get in on the action. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $300 in bonus bets at FanDuel.com. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the National Football League. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Monday. Let's turn our attention now to a coach who's departing the Jets, Jeff Ulbricht, who, of course, was the Jets defensive coordinator for 3 years and change. Actually, defensive coordinator for his full 4-year tenure, and then was the interim head coach for about 3/4 of the season in 2024, is leaving, and he has a new job. He will be the defensive coordinator of the Atlanta Falcons, which ironically is where he was before he came to the Jets. He was the Falcons interim defensive coordinator. It was the last job before he joined the Jets in 2021 as Robert Salah's defensive coordinator. Of course, Ulbricht's tenure was kind of a roller coaster ride. That first year, the Jets had the worst defense in the league. Now, it wasn't really Ulbricht's fault. The Jets had a horrible talent base. Year 2, the talent base upgraded on defense, and wouldn't you know it, the results were better. Jets had an excellent defense in 2022 and 2023. Then 2024 came, and we had an erratic ownership situation. We had a team that was sinking. We had panic within the first 5 weeks, and we had a coaching change, and Robert Salah was let go. And that could be we could spend multiple episodes talking about everything that went into the Robert Salah decision. I mean, if you want to look at how the Jets bring back Robert Salah after that 2023 season where he did a miserable job, and then 5 games into the season in 2024 you fire him, where he's shown no new traits. I mean, everything that had happened, every bad trait Robert Salah showed those first 5 games in 2024 were well known or should have been well known to this team in advance. But the Jets decided to make a coaching change. And as we know, it was ill-fated. Jeff Ulbricht took over 5 games into the season and went 3-9 in the final 12 games. And after the season, all sorts of reports came out that it wasn't really Ulbricht's fault. It was just the team was shocked by the firing of Salah, and that kind of threw everything off. And to the extent the Jets had a chance to turn their season around. I mean, guys have gone on the record and said this stuff. You always hear people complain, well, nobody puts their name on it. There are people who have put their name on the idea that firing Robert Salah just threw the season into chaos. Ulbricht was handled a really bad situation. Now, he handled it poorly, but part of me feels bad for Ulbricht because I said this at the time it happened, so this is not a second guess. It was an impossible situation. A guy who the only head coaching experience Jeff Ulbricht had before the season was last year when he coached the Senior Bowl. So a guy with a college all-star game under his belt as head coach is thrown into a chaotic situation where you have all these big names, all these big egos. You have a season that's kind of on the verge of sinking. You have a team that's thrown into chaos by the head coach being fired, by the owner's erratic behavior, and then you get mad at him for not saving it. I mean, I'm not saying Ulbricht did a bad job. I'm not saying otherwise, but how you expected them to do better given the circumstances is beyond me. It was a really tough spot for him to be put in. Probably the biggest mistake Ulbricht made was keeping himself on as defensive coordinator rather than delegating those duties, because you watch those games and I think you wonder, is Ulbricht able to give either his full attention? I think both the defense and the team as a whole probably suffered, but at the same time, I can't really get mad at him for that, because his theory at the time was, the team had just gotten rid of Salah. Ulbricht not taking a hands-on role on the defense would have just been too much chaos. It would have been too much change. These were the things the owner did not consider. I really think, I think Ulbricht's not head coaching material. I think that's clear. But at some point, you have to stop getting mad at the guy and you just have to ask why people are being put in positions they can't handle, because there was no shock the way he failed, the way that he did it as the head coach. Now, I think it's fair to ask, was Ulbricht that big of an impact? Did Ulbricht have that big of an impact on the defense when it was excellent in 2022 and 2023? I think you could watch the Jets in 2024. You can watch the way the defensive performance deteriorated after Salah left. And you might say, well, you know what? Maybe Salah really was the architect of the defense. I think that's a fair point. I think it's also fair to say Jeff Ulbricht was clearly in over his head as head coach. But again, do you blame the guy who's in over his head, or do you blame the guy who put him in there when he was in over his head? Do you blame the owner who should have known Ulbricht was in over his head? That's where I lay the blame. I think Ulbricht kind of took one for the team. He was thrown into a really tough spot. I think he tried his best. His best obviously wasn't good enough. The Jets did give him an interview for head coach, although I think they probably made it clear that he was not going to get the job, and that's why he decided to take this job with Atlanta. I mean, Ulbricht's job interview was the final 12 games, and obviously the results were just not very good. And any chance of Ulbricht getting that job were eliminated by those final 12 games. How frequently the team looked unprepared, how sloppy the team looked. Ulbricht has to take some of the blame for that. But again, he was just to put a guy into that spot was ridiculous. I mean, And it's not like Ulbricht was some super hot coaching candidate. It's not like teams across the league really wanted Jeff Ulbricht to be their head coach. It's not like anybody viewed Jeff Ulbricht as a future head coaching star. Really a lot of nonsensical decisions by the Jets, particularly the ownership, to put Ulbricht into a spot that almost nobody could have succeeded in. So Ulbricht heads off to Atlanta. And I think that this experience in Atlanta will probably tell us a lot about how good of a coordinator Ulbricht is. I think we know he's not a head coach in this league. The question is, how much was he responsible for the defensive success versus Salah? And I think Atlanta will give us a good answer to that question. But I think Jets did the right thing giving him a head coaching interview. He was in people complained about it. I don't understand what the complaints are. If the Jets are giving interviews to guys like Rex Ryan or Mike Loxley, you can at least give an interview to the guy who ran the team for 12 games and get his thoughts on what went wrong. There's at least some perspective to be learned there. I can't really blame the Jets for at least giving him a token interview. And also, it's just a sign of respect. I mean, getting an interview for a head coaching job is a big deal for an assistant coach. And the Jets had blown him off, I think that would have been a really, I think that would have been a really tough thing to do to a guy who took on a really thankless job. I know Ulbricht's not going to win any popularity awards in Florham Park, and nor should he. I'm not going to sit here and tell you he's the greatest coach who ever lived. He did not do a good job this year. There's no way around it. But I think a lot of times within the fan base and within the media, we look at results. We don't ask how we got there. And how we got there with Ulbricht was just an owner acting completely erratically, owner putting a guy into a situation he couldn't handle, and then an owner getting mad and acting shocked when it didn't work out. So Ulbricht's probably going to a better place than the Jets, because I don't know how good that Atlanta situation is, but it's certainly got to be better than the 2024 Jets. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.